The sky at dawn stretched wide and endless, painted with hues of rose and amber, but Abel Carver hardly noticed its beauty anymore. For 13 long years, his mornings had been as predictable as the slow drip of rain on tin, coffee in his dented cup, boots planted firmly on the porch, and silence wrapping around him like a second skin. Yet, beneath that silence, lived a man who carried wounds deeper than scars, a heart half buried in grief, and a soul that had learned to survive by locking every door to tenderness. It was the kind of solitude that felt safe, but also suffocating, like a cage built from his own hands. And in that stillness, he told himself nothing could disturb his fragile peace. But fate has a way of bending the quietest paths. That morning, when the breeze carried a sound that did not belong, the thin, trembling scream of a woman, it struck through Abel's world like a stone shattering glass. His hand froze on the tin cup, coffee gone cold, eyes narrowing at the horizon as if the land itself was asking him to choose. Stay hidden in silence, or step into a story far larger than his own. He rose slowly, every movement deliberate, as though he knew that once he followed that voice, nothing in his life would remain untouched. The creek bend held more than water. Against the rough stones lay a woman, curled small yet fierce in the quiet of her suffering. Her body bore the cruelty of hands that had stolen her dignity, her clothing torn away as if to erase her very self. Abel felt the air tighten, the way old wounds do when rain approaches. But when her eyes met his, something unspoken passed between them. Not tears, not pleading, but a hollow endurance that stirred a forgotten ache in him. War had shown Abel many forms of cruelty, yet what he saw now carved deeper than any battlefield memory. He turned away, not out of rejection, but out of respect, setting down his weathered cavalry coat on a stone within her reach. "My cabin's just beyond that rise," he murmured into the morning air, his voice rough with years of disuse. Then he walked away, leaving her the only thing he could offer, choice. And though his steps carried him back toward solitude, something unseen lingered. A pulse, a spark, the first crack in walls that had been unbroken for 13 years. As Abel waited at his cabin, he prepared as though for a guest he had not yet admitted to himself. The spare room was cleared, Mary's old dress laid gently on the bed, a silent gift of dignity. When the woman finally appeared at his door, wrapped in his coat like armor, she was no longer faceless suffering but flesh and spirit, fragile and unyielding at once. She did not ask for pity, nor did she cower in fear. She stood at the threshold, as though testing not just his home, but his soul. Abel, for the first time in years, opened his door wider. What entered was not merely a stranger, but a force that would test the limits of his silence, challenge the grief he carried, and ignite the embers of something he had thought forever lost. And so began the unraveling of his solitude, thread by thread, as the presence of one broken soul awakened the possibility of healing in another. Their story was not meant to be rushed. It was carved in the steady rhythm of heartbeats, in the soft clink of coffee cups, in the warmth of words unspoken yet deeply understood. Each moment unfolded like a prayer whispered into the vast Texas sky, a prayer for strength, for healing, for the fragile courage it takes to trust again. If you feel the tremor of this beginning, if something within you recognizes the beauty of brokenness mended, let your heart leave a mark here. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice join this quiet stand for tenderness. And if the light of this story reaches you in your darker days, consider offering your support with a like or a simple subscription. Even the smallest gestures, like seeds dropped into uncertain soil, can bloom into gardens of hope. Together we water those seeds, together we heal, and together we step into what comes next. And so, as night fell and silence returned to the ranch, Abel realized it no longer pressed upon him like a weight. It hummed differently now, carrying within it the presence of another soul. A stranger who would soon become something more, someone who might just turn his exile into belonging. The land stretched endlessly before them both, but for the first time in years the horizon no longer felt empty. It felt alive, with questions, with promise, with the fragile, radiant beginning of love. The cabin stood quiet, the air within touched by the faint smell of wood smoke and coffee that lingered long after Abel had set the table. For years it had been nothing more than a place of survival. 4 walls to hold out storms, a roof to keep away the loneliness of stars. But that evening, as Lena stepped across the threshold, the silence shifted. It was no longer emptiness, but a space waiting to be filled. She clutched the cavalry coat around her, her frame fragile yet unbroken, and Abel's eyes, though he kept them lowered, caught the steady pulse of her will. She was not here to beg. She was here to reclaim herself. He did not press her with questions. He offered what he had: a room, a dress, a meal on the table. The second cup of coffee sat waiting beside a plate of cornbread, and though his hands trembled as he set it down, the gesture carried a tenderness he could not name. When she emerged from the spare room, Mary's dress draping awkwardly yet beautifully on her thin frame, Abel felt time fold strangely. The past and present blurred, the memory of his wife's laughter in that very fabric mingled with the sight of Lena reclaiming her dignity, stitch by stitch. It was not replacement, it was transformation. They ate in silence, the rhythm of spoon and cup carrying meaning where words would only fracture the fragile peace. Abel noticed the deliberate grace of her movements, how even in weariness she carried herself with a quiet discipline, as though reminding herself she was more than what had been done to her. She noticed the way his hands, roughened by years of ranch work and war, moved with surprising care, measured, unhurried, offering space rather than intrusion. Between them, silence became less like an iron wall and more like a bridge. When dusk painted the horizon with bruised violet and gold, Abel stepped onto the porch with his rifle leaning casually against the wall. The sound of horses carried on the evening wind. Dust rose on the trail. He knew without needing to be told who they were. The Holt men had come to reclaim what they believed was theirs. Inside, Lena stiffened, but she did not retreat. Her hand brushed against the frame of the door as if drawing strength from the wood. Her chin lifted, though her knuckles whitened. Abel's chest tightened, not with fear for himself, but with the ache of witnessing her courage. 3 riders reined in before the cabin. Jeremiah Holt, hard-eyed and heavy with entitlement, flanked by his sons. Their presence filled the clearing with a poison Abel had hoped never to taste again. Yet he stood firm, feet planted, voice steady. "This is private land," he said. His words were few, but each one was weighty, unshaken. Jeremiah leaned forward in his saddle, mouth twisting into a smile that carried no warmth. He demanded Lena back. He called her property. He spoke of rights twisted into shackles, of law bent to his will. But before Abel could answer, Lena stepped out, the dress billowing faintly in the breeze. Her silence was sharper than any weapon, her presence on that porch a defiance that words could never match. Jeremiah's voice hardened. His sons shifted uneasily, but Abel did not move aside. He held the line, his body a shield that gave Lena space to claim her choice. And when she moved closer to him, just a step, yet filled with finality, the meaning was carved into the evening air. She would not return to chains. She had chosen freedom. The Holts rode away with threats on their lips, dust cloud trailing behind them like smoke from a dying fire. Abel watched them go, jaw tight, but inside he felt something new, not just anger, but purpose. He turned to find Lena's gaze fixed on the earth beside the cabin, her fingers running through the hard clay as if reading its secrets. "Do you have seeds?" she asked softly, almost surprising herself. Abel blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift, then nodded. "Some from last year." Her hands lingered in the soil, dirt clinging to her skin like a vow. "I can make things grow," she said, her voice carrying both weariness and the faint spark of hope. And Abel realized she was not merely asking for a garden. She was asking for a beginning. That evening, as she marked out a patch of ground with small stones, Abel stood at a distance, watching. Each furrow she traced in the soil was more than planting. It was an act of healing, of reclaiming life from the grip of cruelty. The fading sun caught her hair, casting her in a halo of copper light, and for the first time in 13 years, Abel's silence did not feel like emptiness. It felt like witness. Inside the cabin, the old mended teacup sat untouched on a shelf, its cracks lined faintly with glue from years before. Abel's eyes lingered on it later that night, and he thought of Lena's hands in the soil, her steady defiance against despair. Broken things, he realized, could still be made whole, perhaps even stronger. And as he sat at the table, listening to the soft sounds of her moving within the cabin, Abel felt the first stirrings of something dangerously close to faith. Not in God, not in luck, but in the fragile, fierce resilience of the human heart. The night air grew cooler, the land settling into quiet. Tomorrow would bring more trouble. He knew the Holts would not surrender so easily. But tomorrow also promised green shoots pushing through the earth, a garden stubbornly blooming against barren soil. And between those two truths lay a story neither of them could yet name. The tender, healing thread of love beginning to weave itself into the silence. The first morning, Lena rose before Abel. The cabin carried a different rhythm. For years, Abel's days had been set like clockwork. Coffee, livestock, fences, silence. But now the air seemed to move with a softer cadence. She was at the stove, sleeves rolled to her elbows, stirring a pot with careful precision. The firelight brushed across her face, turning her weariness into something almost luminous. Abel, standing in the doorway, felt the strangeness of it settle into his bones, the sight of another presence not as intruder but as anchor. The silence he had built no longer felt like defense. It felt like waiting, like soil turning for new seed. She glanced at him only briefly, then back to the pot. "Stew," she said, her voice steady, low, touched with a faint apology. "Not much to work with." Abel cleared his throat. words rough as gravel. "More than I'd have managed." He meant it, though his tone came gruff, his body awkward in the nearness of this unfamiliar comfort. She did not smile, but her shoulders eased, and in that easing was a language neither had spoken in years: gratitude without debt, presence without fear. Through the window, Abel watched the dust of riders forming on the horizon. He had expected this. The Holts had not left to surrender. They had left to regroup. His jaw tightened, and he moved with quiet purpose, checking the rifle, squaring his shoulders. Lena's gaze followed him, her hand tightening on the spoon. She did not ask, did not demand explanations, but when the horses slowed before the cabin, she did not hide. Instead, she stood straighter, her eyes calm in their fire, her body aligned with the man who had given her shelter, but not questions. The confrontation came sharp as a blade. Jeremiah Holt, heavy with arrogance, demanded her return. He dressed his words in the veneer of family rights, but every syllable dripped with possession. Samuel leaned in his saddle, smirking with threats unspoken, while Ezekiel looked away, shame flickering in his young features. Abel did not move from the porch, his rifle leaning near, but his voice calm. "She stays if she chooses." And when Lena stepped closer to him, fingers brushing the air near his sleeve, it was no longer Abel's choice alone. It was hers, clear, defiant, visible for all. Jeremiah spat dust and fury, his eyes promising fire yet to come. "This isn't over," he snarled, and when the riders left, their threats lingered like smoke on the wind. Abel exhaled slowly, the weight of years pressing against his chest. Yet when he turned, Lena's gaze had shifted not toward fear, but toward the barren patch of land near the cabin. She knelt in the dirt, running her fingers through the clay as though searching for roots beneath the surface. "Do you have seeds?" she asked again, but this time her tone carried not question but claim. Abel hesitated, then nodded. He found the old tin of beans, squash, tomatoes, remnants of seasons gone. She accepted them with reverence, as though receiving something sacred. By afternoon she had marked the soil, stone by stone, her movements steady, deliberate. Abel stood nearby, watching, his breath caught on the smallest things, the way she bent to the earth with patience, the way the setting sun touched her hair, the way resilience lived in her hands. Each furrow she carved was more than planting, it was defiance against despair, it was healing. When night fell, Abel entered the cabin to find the air different again. The floor swept, shelves ordered, a quiet order stitched into his once barren space. She had moved carefully, not erasing Mary's presence, but weaving her own. He noticed it most when his eyes landed on the teacup, Mary's last unbroken relic, sitting untouched on the shelf. For 13 years he had let it stand as memory. Now, in the presence of this woman who planted gardens in clay soil, it seemed less like a relic of loss and more like a vessel waiting to be filled again. They ate together, stew rich with flavors Abel had long forgotten. The silence between them softened into comfort. Every small exchange, her passing him the bread, his nod of thanks, was stitched with the beginnings of trust. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it both promise and threat. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring the Holts again, and perhaps with them fire and fury. But tonight, in the glow of lamplight, he allowed himself to believe in something gentler. Lena lifted her eyes to him once, and in their quiet meeting, Abel felt the fragile thread of connection tighten, delicate yet unbreakable. Healing did not arrive in thunder or blaze. It arrived in small movements, soil pressed over seeds, a mended shelf, a shared meal. Abel, who had once believed his life ended in silence, now felt the beginning of something impossible to name. Love, perhaps. Not swift, not burning, but steady as roots digging deep into stubborn ground. And when the fire outside dimmed to embers, when the night closed its hands around the ranch, Abel leaned back in his chair, the taste of her stew still lingering, the sight of her hands folded quietly in her lap, etched in his memory. Tomorrow would demand battle, but tonight there was peace. And in that peace, healing stretched like dawn across the horizon, promising that even in a world scarred by cruelty, something tender could still take root. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost like life rediscovered. Lena tended the small plot of earth behind the cabin, her hands working with quiet determination, coaxing stubborn clay into the promise of growth. Abel watched her from a distance at first, his work on the fence line deliberate, but his eyes drawn often to the figure bending to the soil. There was a grace in her labor that stirred something in him, an echo of what had been lost, and a seed of what might yet be found. She was not a guest, she was not a burden, she was a presence that shifted silence into companionship, loss into healing. Each evening, they shared meals at the rough-hewn table, the lamplight softening the harsh lines of the cabin. Conversation was sparse, but the quiet between them no longer pressed like a weight. Abel found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps, for the scrape of chair legs when she sat, for the low murmur of her voice when she finally began to speak in fragments of her past. He learned of Walter Holt's cruelty, of nights filled with fear, of the iron grip of a family that saw her as property rather than woman. She spoke without self-pity, her words steady as stones laid one by one. Abel listened, his silence no longer a wall but a shelter. It was during one of those evenings, as twilight bled into indigo, that the sound of horses broke the fragile peace. A dust cloud unfurled along the horizon, carrying with it the unmistakable weight of intent. Abel's jaw tightened as he set his cup down, the old instinct of vigilance rising within him. "Stay inside," he said softly, though Lena's eyes met his with defiance that mirrored the strength she was slowly reclaiming. Still, she did as he asked, standing just within the doorway where her presence could not be erased. Jeremiah Holt rode at the front, his sons at his side, the arrogance in their posture as clear as the weapons at their belts. They reined in close to the porch, eyes narrowing at the sight of Lena in a dress that no longer marked her as broken but as whole. Jeremiah's voice rang sharp against the evening stillness. "She belongs to us. The law says so. Family has rights." His words dripped with authority, twisted into chains, but Abel did not flinch. His hand rested near his rifle, not as threat, but as line drawn. "This land is mine," Abel said evenly, "and she stays, if she chooses." The air trembled with the weight of those words. Samuel smirked, eyes sliding over Lena with the same cruelty she had endured too long. But before he could speak, Lena stepped forward, the threshold no longer barrier, but platform. Her silence cut sharper than argument. Her gaze fixed on her father-in-law, with a steadiness that unsettled even Ezekiel, the youngest, who shifted uneasily in his saddle. Jeremiah's face darkened, his control slipping against the quiet force of her refusal. When Lena moved closer to Abel, her choice visible, undeniable, it was more than defiance. It was reclamation. Jeremiah's voice hardened into a threat. "This isn't over, Carver. You've made yourself an enemy where you could have had peace." His words left a chill in the air long after the riders turned back toward town, their silhouettes swallowed by the falling night. Abel stood in the silence that followed, the weight of what had begun settling heavy on his shoulders. He knew men like Jeremiah did not surrender. They retaliated. But when he turned, Lena's gaze was not on the departing riders. It was on the patch of earth where green shoots had begun to push through the soil. Her fingers traced the edges of the furrows as though grounding herself in the promise of life. "It will grow," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "No matter what they do, it will grow." That night, as Abel checked the locks and stoked the fire, he glanced at the shelf where Mary's teacup still sat, its cracks faint yet unhidden. He thought of Lena's garden, of roots reaching through unyielding earth, of life carved out of hardship. Broken things, he realized, could be mended, not erased, not made flawless, but made stronger in their lines of healing. The truth of it seeped into him as steady as the warmth of the fire. Sleep came restless, filled with echoes of war, of fire, of the inevitability of conflict. Yet, threaded through those shadows was something else. The memory of Lena standing beside him on the porch, her presence not hidden, but declared. In that image lay not just defiance, but the fragile beginnings of trust. And trust, Abel knew, was more dangerous and more precious than any weapon he had ever carried. By morning, the sun cast gold across the land, glinting off the thin blades of green in Lena's garden. Abel stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, and for the first time in 13 years, he did not face away from town. He faced east, toward the horizon, toward whatever would come. The silence around him felt different now, not like exile, but like the pause before something begins. And as Lena stepped outside to join him, her hand brushing the wood of the railing, the day seemed less empty, more alive, as though the land itself was beginning to breathe again. The morning after the Holt men's threats, Abel rode into town with a basket of eggs, a simple errand that suddenly carried the weight of hidden dangers. The general store smelled of coffee beans and leather, of molasses barrels stacked in the corner, of ordinary life untouched by violence. But Abel knew eyes followed him. Conversation dulled as he entered, men by the stove lowering their voices just enough for their whispers to sting sharper than shouts. He kept his face impassive, each movement careful, his silence the armor he had worn since war and grief. Yet when Sarah Wheeler, the shopkeeper, wrapped his supplies and leaned close, her warning was soft and urgent. "They're searching for her. They'll come." Abel nodded once, his jaw tight. He took the plain brown parcel she pressed into his hands, a dress, stockings, small necessities for a woman trying to reclaim her dignity. "No charge," she said firmly, though he left coins on the counter anyway. Small kindnesses carried weight in a world where cruelty strutted loud. And as he left, he felt the sheriff's gaze from across the street, unreadable beneath a heavy moustache, the law tangled in debts and silence. When Abel returned, Lena had swept the cabin, the hearth glowing with new fire, and stew simmering in a pot that filled the room with warmth. The sight caught him like a fist to the chest. For 13 years his home had been nothing more than a shelter for a solitary man. Now it felt alive, tended with care, not born of obligation, but of quiet strength. He set Sarah's bundle on the table. "From town," he said, his voice gruff with more feeling than he allowed. Lena's hands lingered on the package as if holding a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered, the first words he had heard from her lips. 2 syllables, yet they loosened something in him that had been locked for years. They ate together that evening, the stew rich, the silence between them softened by the simple grace of shared food. Abel studied her carefully, not in pity, but in recognition. She was not only wounded, she was resilient. The way she carried herself, measured, deliberate, with dignity reclaimed in each gesture, spoke of a spirit unbroken. Lena, too, noticed the small changes in him. How he poured her coffee before his own. How his voice, though spare, held no hardness when it was turned toward her. Their silences no longer pressed down like burdens. They became a space where trust might take root. But peace is always fragile. Dust rose at dusk, the sign of riders approaching. Abel's rifle leaned near the porch post as he stepped outside, his stance calm but unyielding. Jeremiah Holt's voice carried across the yard, demanding what he believed belonged to him. He spoke of family, of rights twisted into chains, of property dressed as law. Samuel smirked, eyes dripping with cruelty. Ezekiel looked away, shame heavy in his downcast gaze. Abel said little, but every word fell like iron. She stays, if she chooses. Then Lena stepped out beside him. Wrapped in the dress Sarah had given, her face steady despite the whiteness of her knuckles, she stood taller than her fear. She said nothing, but her silence was declaration enough. When she moved closer to Abel, her choice plain for all to see, Jeremiah's fury cracked through his composure. "This isn't over," he snarled, before reining his horse and retreating with his sons, dust rising like smoke in their wake. When the last echo of hooves faded, Lena turned her gaze not toward the trail of her enemies, but to the small patch of earth she had claimed. With the fading light, she pressed seeds into the ground, her hands steady, though her body trembled. Abel watched her kneel in the soil, her face softened by twilight, and felt a warmth stir in him that was both unfamiliar and dangerously close to hope. This was not just planting. This was defiance. This was healing. Later that night, Abel prepared for rest, but found Lena at the table, her hands brushing over Mary's old teacup. The delicate porcelain bore the fine cracks of age, lines mended with glue long ago, fragile but whole. She lifted it gently, turning it in her hands, eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Things that break can be mended," she murmured. Abel stood in the doorway, silent, struck by how her words seemed to reach into his chest and pull loose the grief he had kept hidden for 13 years. He thought of Mary, of war, of silence that had walled him in. And now this woman, scarred yet unyielding, spoke of brokenness as not the end, but a beginning. They drank coffee together from the mended cup, passing it between them, an unspoken vow forming in the ritual. Outside, the garden soil held the promise of life. Inside, The cabin breathed with the quiet strength of two souls learning to trust. Abel felt the weight of the Holt's threat pressing against the horizon, but for the first time the fear did not consume him. What had begun between them, silent, fragile, unhurried, was stronger than any chain of law or cruelty. It was the beginning of love, rooted in broken places, watered by courage, warmed by the healing fire of shared silence. And as dawn crept across the land once more, Abel found himself standing on the porch with Lena beside him. He no longer faced away from town. He faced the horizon. The silence that once imprisoned him now opened like a path, leading not into loneliness, but into the vast, trembling possibility of a life shared. The day would bring more trials. He knew it with the certainty of a man who had lived through war. But with her presence beside him, Abel no longer felt like a man waiting for loss. He felt like a man ready to live again. Night pressed heavy against the ranch, the sky wide and black, stars burning like watchful eyes. Abel had long since grown used to the silence of darkness, the creak of wood settling, the sigh of the wind through cottonwoods. Yet this night was different. The air itself felt charged, waiting. Lena's presence within the cabin changed the very texture of quiet, turning it from a hollow emptiness into something living, breathing, fragile as a flame that must be guarded. The attack came with fire. Abel woke to the acrid sting of smoke, to the orange glow bleeding against the walls. The barn roared like a furnace, flames leaping skyward as horses screamed inside. His body moved before thought, instincts sharpened by war. Boots pulled on, rifle in hand, voice breaking the night. "Buckets! Pump by the well!" Lena was already moving, skirts gathered, hands flying as she rallied water from the pump. Abel plunged into the inferno, dragging horses out, his lungs seared with smoke, skin burning from the heat. Lena passed buckets down the line she made alone, determination steady, though she knew the fight was lost before it began. By dawn, the barn was ash, tools melted, half the winter hay consumed in flames. Abel stood amid the wreckage, soot streaked across his face, muscles trembling with exhaustion. Lena came to his side, her hands raw from carrying water, her face pale but unbowed. "This was them," she said softly, though no proof was needed. Abel nodded, his eyes cold with knowledge. The Holts had escalated. This was no longer a battle of words and threats. It was war waged in shadow. Later, when the smoke cleared and silence returned, Lena entered the cabin to find Abel packing. His saddlebags lay open, ammunition, jerky, coffee tucked inside with grim efficiency. His rifle leaned ready against the wall. Her body froze at the sight, the truth dawning like a blade. "You're leaving," she said, her voice low but steady, though her hands trembled at her sides. Abel turned, surprise flickering across his features, then hardening into resolve. "Going to end this my way." "With violence," she said, not as a question but as truth laid bare. Abel did not deny it, his jaw set in a line carved from years of battle. "With whatever works." Her breath caught, but she did not falter. She stepped forward, eyes burning with a quiet ferocity. "So you'll become a killer again, as in the war?" Abel's hand stilled on the saddle strap, his body rigid. The past he never spoke of lay heavy in the room. "How did you—" he began, but she cut him off gently. "Sarah told me." "About the scout?" About the deputy who walked away after blood was on his hands. Silence stretched like a chasm between them, fragile and dangerous. Abel turned back to his bags, walls slamming down where vulnerability had cracked. That was a different life. "And this?" Lena asked, her voice breaking. "Will you drag that life here? Destroy yourself because of me?" Her composure wavered then, the first crack in her careful control. She moved to gather her few possessions, speaking with quiet finality. "Then I will leave. Better I go back to town, find Sarah, vanish, than see you burn down because I stayed." Her words pierced him, sharp and clean. Abel's hand tightened on the doorframe, torn between fury and despair. He turned to answer, but the sound of shattering porcelain stopped him cold. His eyes fell to the floor where Mary's last teacup lay in fragments, the relic he had guarded for 13 years, now broken by accident. Lena knelt at once, her hands trembling as she gathered the pieces, tears spilling silent down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice raw. "It was hers." Abel dropped his saddlebags, the weight of choice pulling him down. He knelt beside her, rough hands joining hers in collecting shards. "Just a cup," he said, though the ache in his voice betrayed more. Together, they carried the pieces to the table. Lena found the old glue used for mending harnesses, and with careful, patient hands began piecing the fragments together. Abel watched her, the quiet rhythm of her healing act more powerful than any speech. "Things that break can be mended," she murmured, eyes fixed on her work. "Not the same, but sometimes stronger." The words settled deep in Abel's chest, loosening the grip of rage, opening space where something gentler might live. He sat with her until the cup, though imperfect, stood whole again, its scars visible yet holding. Abel's voice was rough when he finally spoke. "I'm not leaving to kill them. I was going to file papers at the county seat. Deed to the ranch, both our names, partnership agreement. If something happens to me, you're protected." Lena's hands stilled, her eyes lifting to meet his. Shock, then something softer moved through her expression. "Both our names?" Abel nodded, his gaze steady. "Been alone too long. Walls keep people out, but they also keep you in. I lost one life already. I won't lose another by running." Her throat tightened, but she held his gaze. "Then I won't let you stand alone. Not any more." They finished mending the cup together, their fingers brushing as they pressed fragile shards into place. It stood on the table between them, no longer flawless, but stronger in its lines of healing. They passed coffee between its scarred edges, a ritual of trust, of fragile love taking root. Outside, the land still smelled of smoke, the barn reduced to ruin. But inside, in the glow of lamplight, two broken souls found something new, strength in mending, courage in staying, love in silence that was no longer empty but shared. And when the sound of a lone rider approached at dusk, Abel rose with rifle in hand, but his steps carried something different than before. He was not simply a man defending his land. He was a man who had chosen to fight with and for someone he could not let go. Lena stood at the window, the mended cup warm between her hands, and whispered into the fading light. "Together." The rider who came at dusk was Jacob Holt, the youngest of Jeremiah's sons, and unlike his father or brothers, he carried no arrogance in his eyes. He rode slow, hands raised, voice trembling with urgency. Abel met him at the yard's edge, rifle balanced easy but ready, while Lena stood in the doorway, her figure outlined by lamplight. Jacob dismounted, leaving his weapon on the saddle, turning his pockets inside out with the careful obedience of a man who had seen enough violence to fear it. His words spilled out, low and rough. "They mean to come tomorrow night. Not law, not family honor. Fire, guns, 8 men, maybe more. They'll burn you out. Call it justice." His shame clung to every syllable, but his warning carried weight heavier than any oath. Abel studied him, the boy's face pale with exhaustion, stubble dark against his jaw. Jacob's shoulders sagged with the burden of turning against blood, but his eyes did not waver. "I can't go back," he said, voice quiet but resolute. "Not after this. Not after what they did to her." Lena stepped forward, her hands steady on the shotgun. But when her gaze touched Jacob's, she saw not deceit, but fracture. Another soul broken under Jeremiah's cruelty. Another heart searching for redemption. She lowered the barrel slowly, her voice soft yet sharp as glass. "Then speak plain. What are they planning?" Inside the cabin, the map of betrayal unfolded across the rough wooden table, Jacob's finger tracing lines of attack. "They'll come from 3 sides. Fire the outbuildings first. Force you toward the creek. Samuel's been drinking, swears he'll drag her back, even if he has to break her first. Deputy Morris rides with them, badge as cover for blood." Abel listened with calm that only years of war could carve into a man. His eyes, dark and steady, calculated angles, distances, survival. But Lena saw more in him than tactics. She saw the weight of a man who had buried too much, yet still chose to stand. When Jacob finished, silence filled the room, broken only by the pop of fire in the hearth. Abel poured him coffee, sliding the cup across without words. Hospitality, even in the shadow of betrayal. Jacob blinked at the gesture, fingers curling around the warmth as if it were absolution. "Why warn us?" Lena asked, her voice even but carrying the edge of curiosity. Jacob's eyes lowered. "Because right is right. And because what they did to you—" His voice faltered, shame choking him. "It was wrong. All of it." The night deepened, and with it came decision. Abel stood, his resolve sharp as the steel of his rifle. "We ride to town. Reverend Collins, Sarah Wheeler, Thomas Reyes. Whoever will stand." Lena's chin lifted, her presence firm beside him. "We will not be driven from home again." Her use of "we" stirred something fierce inside Abel, a word binding them tighter than any paper, tighter than any vow spoken aloud. They saddled the horses in silence, Jacob lingering in the shadows, torn between kinship and conscience. "I'll hide at your line shack north," he said, his voice low. "If they move early, I'll send word." Abel nodded once, acknowledging both the risk and the courage. Lena, before mounting, took one last look at the small garden. Tiny shoots broke through the soil, green against the night. The sight steadied her heart. "It will grow," she whispered again, and Abel, hearing her, felt the words root inside him like a promise. The ride to town was cloaked in moonlight, hooves muffled against earth, every shadow holding the threat of ambush. Yet, with Lena beside him, Abel felt less the solitude of an old soldier and more the weight of partnership. They reached the church at the town's edge, where light glowed faintly from the Reverend's window. Michael Collins opened the door with a Bible in one hand, a revolver in the other, his eyes narrowing until he saw who stood there. "Come in quick," he said, ushering them into the warmth of lamplight. Inside the study, lined with books, Abel laid the partnership papers on the desk. Collins read with solemn care, his brow furrowing at the unusual arrangement, yet his voice carried no judgment. "This protects her," he said, stamping his notary seal. "Makes her co-owner, strips Jeremiah of legal claim, but it will not stop bullets tomorrow night." Abel nodded, his face shadowed by firelight. "No, but it strips their excuse. What follows will be murder, plain." As if summoned by fate, Sarah Wheeler arrived with supplies, Thomas Reyes with his rifle, Eliza Thornton with sharp eyes and sharper words. One by one, they filled the Reverend's small room until it brimmed not only with bodies but with courage. They chose to stand, not because they owed Abel, not because Lena had asked, but because fear had ruled the county too long. Lena sat at the table among them, her hands wrapped around a shawl Sarah pressed into her grasp. She felt the weight of community for the first time since her world had shattered. Abel's eyes met hers across the crowded room, and in that glance she felt steadied, tethered, healed in ways words could never capture. By dawn, they rode out together, 6 souls against 8, carrying not only rifles but witness. Abel had fought alone for years, but now, as the ranch rose into view and dust clouds gathered on the horizon, he knew he no longer carried silence by himself. Beside him, Lena straightened her spine, her gaze steady on the land she now claimed as home. Brokenness had brought them together. Healing would hold them there. And as the sun spilled gold across the horizon, Abel whispered a vow only she could hear. Not alone. Not ever again. The morning rose in fire and silence. Dust curled on the horizon where Jeremiah Holt and his men rode, their silhouettes sharp against the rising sun. Abel stood on the porch with his rifle balanced loose at his side, Lena beside him in the doorway, her dress plain yet dignified, her presence steady as an oak. Around them the unlikely alliance had gathered, Reverend Collins with his Bible and revolver, Sarah Wheeler with quiet resolve, Thomas Reyes with the steel of his hammer-strong arms, Eliza Thornton sharp-eyed and unyielding, and even Jacob, youngest son of the Holt clan, standing not with his blood, but with his conscience. 6 against 8, a fragile line drawn not with numbers, but with truth. Jeremiah halted his men halfway, his face twisting when he saw the witnesses. His voice rang loud, bluster covering fear. "She's ours by law, by family, by blood." His words cracked like brittle branches in dry wind. Deputy Morris shifted uneasily, the badge on his chest no longer shield, but weight, the presence of the reverend and townsfolk breaking the illusion of justice. Samuel reached for his pistol, arrogance in his smirk, but Jacob stepped forward, blocking his path, voice firm for the first time. "No more, Pa. No more threats. No more fire. No more chains." Silence rippled across the yard, the truth too sharp to ignore. Ezekiel lowered his eyes, shame pulling him inward. The hired guns glanced at one another, unwilling to fire in daylight before witnesses who would speak. And Lena stepped out from the doorway, shoulders square, voice carrying steady through the morning air. "I am not yours. I am not property. I am free, and I choose to stay." The words struck harder than any bullet. Jeremiah's fury flared, his power cracking like old timber. But the tide had already turned. Reverend Collins lifted his Bible, declaring before all, "The law of God and the law of man will both bear witness today. This woman stands free." Sarah's voice joined his, sharp and unwavering. "And so does this land." Abel raised the partnership papers for all to see, his voice steady as stone. "This ranch is hers as much as mine. You come here again, it will be trespass, it will be attempted murder, and there will be no silence to shield you." The balance shifted. Fear, once the Holt family's weapon, dissolved in daylight. One by one, Jeremiah's grip slipped. Morris dropped his hand, refusing to move. One of the hired guns reined back his horse. Ezekiel placed a hand on his father's arm, murmuring something only he could hear. Jeremiah's eyes burned, but even he could see the ground had soured. With a bitter gesture, he turned his horse. "This isn't over," he spat, but the words fell hollow, drowned by the weight of witnesses. The Holt men rode off, their power cracked, their shadow thinning like smoke in wind. When silence returned, Abel lowered his rifle. His hand found Lena's, their fingers intertwining, not as shield and protected, but as partners. Around them, the others exhaled, laughter breaking through the tension, small and healing as spring rain after drought. Sarah unpacked bread and coffee, Thomas added wood to the fire, Eliza poured truth into every corner of gossip she would soon spread. What had been a battleground turned into a breakfast table, not because bullets fired, but because voices rose together. The land, scarred but unbroken, began to breathe again. The weeks that followed carried quiet repair. Neighbors came with lumber and nails, raising a new barn where ashes had cooled. Jacob stayed on, working as ranch hand, his shoulders bent with labor, but his spirit lighter, freed from his father's shadow. Thomas lent his strength on weekends. Sarah's store supplied what was needed without debt, and the Reverend returned often, reminding Abel that faith could be found not only in Scripture, but in the simple act of standing beside another. And Lena's garden grew, green shoots pushing through stubborn clay, rows of beans and squash rising toward the sun. Each plant was more than food. It was testament. From broken ground, life still flourished. By late summer, fireflies shimmered across the meadow, and Abel and Lena sat together on the porch, the mended teacup between them. They passed it back and forth, coffee warm in their hands, the fine cracks catching the lamplight like veins of gold. What once symbolized loss now marked resilience. Abel turned the cup slowly, his voice rough, vulnerable. "Wouldn't have thought silence could feel this alive." Lena leaned against him, her hand warm in his. "That's because it's not silence anymore," she whispered. "It's home." The night wrapped them in stillness, stars scattering blessings across the wide Texas sky. Abel, once a man bound by grief, and Lena, once a woman stripped of dignity, now sat side by side, their wounds not erased, but carried, their scars not hidden, but honored. Broken things had been mended, not perfect, not flawless, but stronger for the breaking. And in that truth lived the deepest healing. Love, not as lightning strike, not as firestorm, but as slow dawn spreading across barren land, turning exile into belonging, fear into freedom, silence into song. If this story has touched your heart, if you've felt the warmth of resilience and the quiet strength of healing love, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. A simple like, a subscription, even a word of encouragement helps these stories continue to bloom, just as seeds grow stronger when watered by many hands. Your presence here means more than you know. Together, we keep the light alive.